There's a kind of quiet that settles over the high desert just before dawn, the kind that doesn't feel like peace so much as a held breath. Like the land itself is waiting to see what kind of day this is going to be. Willa Durance knew that quiet. She had lived inside it for 26 years, ever since she followed her husband Hector out to a 320-acre homestead in the Red Rock country east of Tucson, where the Rincon Mountains caught the first light like burning copper, and the saguaro stood in the arroyos like silent witnesses to everything the desert had seen and was still deciding how to judge. Hector died of pneumonia the winter of 1894. He was 51 years old, which felt both too young and, given what the land had asked of him, exactly as long as a man could last on pure stubbornness and deep water. Willa was 58. She had 3 children grown and gone and one who had come back. I want to tell you something about that, about the one who came back, but I'm not ready for him yet. Because before I get to Marcus Durance and what he did, I need you to understand something about Willa herself. She was not a woman who required rescuing. She had sheared 500 head of merino with her own hands in a single week after the hired shearers walked off in the middle of the job over a wage dispute. She had kept a herd through the killing drought of '86 by hauling water in barrels from a secondary spring 3 miles south twice a day for 11 weeks. She had renegotiated her territorial water rights claim in front of a Pima County land commissioner when she was 44 years old, armed with a deed, a surveyor's plat, and the particular precision of a woman who has spent 2 decades reading every document that crossed her threshold. She was careful. She was exact. She was the sort of rancher that other ranchers, the men who ran the big operations up toward Wilcox, consulted on land questions when they thought nobody was watching, which she found quietly amusing. What she was not, what she had never been in all those decades on that hard red ground, was inclined to trust a document she hadn't read herself, until her eyes started failing her. The trouble had come on gradually the way the hardest troubles do. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in slow increments that you keep explaining away until one afternoon the print on a bill of sale swims before you, and you realize you haven't been reading it, you've been guessing at it for the better part of a year. The Tucson physician she finally consulted was a careful man with an honest face, and he told her plainly the deterioration at the center of her field of vision would continue. She could read with a strong magnifying lens if the light was good, and she took her time. She should not under any circumstances sign documents she had not been able to read for herself. She thanked him. She acquired a magnifying glass, a fine one, brass-fitted with a long ebony handle, and she adapted the way she had adapted to every other hard fact the territory had presented her with over 26 years. And she continued reading every document herself. I need to tell you about Cord Mabry before I tell you about Marcus, because Cord matters. Cord Mabry had worked Willa Durance's land for 9 years. He had come to her in the spring of 1887, 36 years old, lean as a fence post with the kind of sun-weathered face that puts a man's age somewhere between 35 and 60 and refuses to be more specific than that. He had been a wrangler for the big consolidated cattle operation north of Benson before their range manager cut him loose in a round of cost reductions that had more to do with politics than productivity. He came to her with references, a working knowledge of desert ranching that went bone deep and a directness that she recognized immediately as the real article. He had looked her straight in the eye when she interviewed him, unusual enough for a hand presenting himself to a woman rancher, and said, "I work hard, I don't drink on the job, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong. If any of that's a problem, I understand." She had hired him on the spot. 9 years had changed the shape of their working relationship in ways that neither of them discussed openly, which suited them both. He knew which pastures she wanted rested, and when knew the temperaments of her breeding bulls and her prize mares, knew how to read the sky above the rincones for weather that wasn't showing yet on the valley floor. He brought her news she needed to hear when it was inconvenient. He had rerouted the secondary spring channel in the drought year at his own initiative and presented her with the plan after the fact, which had earned him a silence from her so long and charged with something she refused to name, that he had thought briefly she might let him go. She had looked at the plan instead. She had said, "This would have saved us 3 days on the haul." He had said, "Yes, ma'am." She had said, "Don't do it again without asking." And then it was good thinking. That had been that. He had been watching her eyes worsen for 2 years with a care he did not express directly, which was the only kind of care Willa Durance was inclined to accept. He made sure the correspondence that needed answering was read to her without being asked. He positioned documents in better light when she reached for the magnifying glass. He said nothing about any of it because she had not asked him to, and because she was the kind of woman who would have found discussion of the matter considerably more difficult to accept than the practical accommodations themselves. How was, and I want you to hold this, the sort of man who loves with patience rather than declaration. The sort of man who builds a thing carefully instead of announcing he's going to build it. The sort of man who understood that Willa Durance had 26 years of hard ground and one dead husband and an entire territory's worth of people who had underestimated her behind her, and that she was not looking for anyone to take over. She was looking, if she was looking for anything, for someone whose presence made the weight of it a little less absolute. Cord Mabry had been that presence for 9 years and had not said so, because he had not been sure she wanted it said, and because, and this is the truth of it, some part of him understood that saying it would change something, and that the thing it would change was currently working, and that working was its own kind of grace. Marcus Durance was 31 years old when he came back to the Rincon spread from Los Angeles. He had been out in California for 3 years, doing what exactly Willa had never been entirely certain. He said he was in mining investment. He said the market had shifted. He arrived in the fall of 1895 on the Southern Pacific with a single trunk and the easy confidence of a man who has run through money and is calculating without showing it where the next supply might come from. Willa took him in. He was her son. She had a room in the east wing of the adobe and a seat at the supper table, and she told herself this was temporary, which she believed when she said it. And for the first several months, I want to be fair, Marcus was useful. He fixed the warped gate on the south corral. He drove Willa to Tucson for her appointments. He sat with her in the evenings when the wind came down off the rincons, and he listened when she talked about Hector and about the land, and she found herself recalibrating, not forgiving whatever vague failures had produced his California debts, but revising her estimate of the man he might yet choose to become. How was her son? She loved him in the complicated, aching way you love the people who arrived in your life as perfect and left as something more difficult. So when he sat down with her at the kitchen table in October and said with the right note of careful concern in his voice that he worried about her managing the legal correspondence and the property filings with her eyes, the way they were when he said he'd like to help her with all of that, keep things organized, handle the banking correspondence, review the documents, so she didn't have to struggle. She hesitated only briefly. She said yes. She said yes because he was her son. She said yes because the house was quieter than it ought to be and Marcus's return had filled some of that quiet. She said yes because part of her had never stopped believing in the man she thought she had raised him to be. And she said yes because he was at the appointment in Tucson when the doctor described her condition plainly. He had been in that room. He had heard the words, deterioration of central vision, cannot reliably read standard print without magnification. He knew. He had been sitting right there when the physician said it. What Willa did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that 5 weeks before that kitchen table conversation, Marcus had received a visitor in Tucson. The man's name was Beaumont Creel. Creel was a land speculator operating out of Phoenix, fronting a syndicate of Eastern investors who had been assembling parcels along the Southern Pacific corridor between Tucson and Lordsburg for the better part of 18 months. There was a new spur survey under consideration, not yet public, not yet filed, that would put a rail stop within 6 miles of the Durance property. Land in the corridor had been quietly appreciating. Most of the current owners had not registered it yet. Creel had made an inquiry to Willa directly the previous year through proper channels. She had declined without discussion. The land was not for sale. It had never been for sale. Hector had built the main house with his own hands from adobe brick they had pressed themselves. She had planted the kitchen garden that still grew along the south wall. She had a memory rooted in every acre of that ground, and she was not interested in discussing alternatives. So Creel found a different door. When Marcus appeared in the picture back at the ranch handling his mother's affairs, a man with debts and access to a woman who could not read the documents she was signing, Creel recognized the shape of the opportunity. The approach was made through an intermediary careful as a land survey with all the proper distances maintained. The offer was specific, $3,500. Not commission, not a share of the sale price. $3,500 personally to Marcus Durance for facilitating the transfer of the deed on the Rincon property, for delivering his mother's signature on a document she would not be able to read without assistance that he would not provide. Marcus took 2 weeks to decide, then he said yes. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I know the question you're carrying. You're asking how a son does that, how a man looks at the woman who raised him, who took him back in without conditions, who made room at her table and decides she is worth $3,500 in a lie. I've thought on it. I don't have a clean answer. What I know is that men in debt tell themselves stories. They tell themselves the land will come to them eventually anyway. They tell themselves she is old and can live with his sister in Santa Fe. They tell themselves it is practically estate management if you look at it from the right angle. What they do not permit themselves to think about is the woman at the kitchen table with the magnifying glass in her pocket who has not been told a word of any of this. The document was a warranty deed. It transferred the Durance 320 acres the land, the house, the outbuildings, the water rights, the kitchen garden along the south wall, the grave of Hector Durance at the north end of the Cottonwood Grove from Wilhelmina, Ruth Durance to Marcus Henry Durance for the stated consideration of $1 and other valuable consideration. It was filed with the Pima County Recorder in Tucson on a Wednesday morning in late October. The notary who certified it was a man named Pell Coover, a territorial functionary who had known Marcus since he was a boy and whose record of professional diligence was by the time of this transaction primarily theoretical. He certified the signature. He did not ask the signatory to read the document. He did not read it to her. Willa had been told it was a water rights easement renewal required paperwork before she could finalize a grazing agreement with the neighboring San Pedro operation. That was what Marcus said. He read her the top section of the document. The title, 2 lines of the recital clause. Her magnifying glass was in her skirt pocket. He did not suggest she use it. For 6 weeks, the surface of things did not change. Marcus continued working the south pasture rotation. He continued driving Willa to her appointments. He repaired the crumbling section of the north wall and oiled every saddle in the tack room, and was by all outward measure exactly the useful son he had presented himself as being. Willa noticed occasionally a quality of distraction about him, a way of looking through conversations rather than at them, that she attributed to the adjustment of returning to open country life after years in a city. She did not press. She trusted him. And then Cord Mabry came in from the East Range. It was a morning in late November, cold in the particular way the desert floor goes cold in that season. The warmth fully departed, but the hard freeze not yet arrived, so that the air had an edge without quite committing to it. Cord had been checking the waterline survey markers along the eastern boundary, a routine maintenance ride he took every 6 weeks when he found 2 men he did not know running a transit level through the far pasture. He asked them their business. They said they were conducting a preliminary title survey on behalf of the new owner pending formal acquisition. He asked them to say that again. They said it again. He rode in at a lope. He found Willa in the East Corral working with a 2-year-old mare she had been gentling for the better part of 3 weeks, and he stepped down from his horse and took his hat off and told her what he had seen. He told it straight the way he told her everything. No preparation, no softening, because he had learned in 9 years that she found preparation an insult. She wanted the information. He gave it. She did not interrupt. She said, "Did they give a name?" He said they wouldn't, but they had a survey contract. I asked to see it. He produced a folded paper from his coat, not the contract itself, but a receipt he had copied down by hand, word for word from the surveyor's job order, because after 9 years, he knew that she would want to verify every detail herself. She read it. The contracting party was listed as Creole Land and Development, Phoenix, Arizona Territory. Willa stood in the corral for a long time. The mare shifted against her hand patient as only young horses that have been gentled gently can be. She said, "Cord, I need to go inside." He said, "I'll wait." She said, "No, come with me." She sat at the kitchen table, the same chair, the same lamp she had sat under when she signed what Marcus told her was an easement renewal, and she took the deed box from the shelf above the stove. Marcus had reorganized her papers when he arrived. She had let him. It had seemed efficient. The deed was in the box, recent, folded once. She took out her magnifying glass. She positioned it in the light from the south window, which at this hour of the morning gave the best reading light in the house. She read the document, all of it, every word, slowly. When she set it down, she set the magnifying glass on top of it and rested both hands flat on the table and said nothing for a long time. Cord stood near the door. He did not speak. He understood that she was not in need of commentary. She looked up at him. She said, 9 years. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "In 9 years, have you ever once told me something wasn't true?" His gray eyes were steady on hers. He said, "No." She said, "I need you to take me to Tucson. "There's a woman attorney on Congress Street I need to see." He said, "I'll hitch the wagon." She said, "The buggy, faster." I was out the door before she finished the sentence. Evangelina Cross had her law office in a building she owned on the second floor above a dry goods store on Congress Street in Tucson, on a block where the adobe buildings had been standing for 40 years and would stand for 40 more. She was 42 years old, the daughter of a Sonoran family that had held land in the territory since before the Gadsden Purchase, and had spent the better part of 2 generations watching that land be contested, diminished, and in some cases simply taken by men who understood that paperwork properly applied was considerably more efficient than armed confrontation. She had studied law by correspondence and examination, and had been admitted to the Arizona bar in 1889. She had been practicing land title litigation since before the ink on her admission certificate was dry. She read deeds the way a tracker reads ground, for what the disturbed earth told you about what had passed over it, not for what anyone claimed to have been walking by. Cord brought Willa to her office on a Thursday afternoon. Willa brought the deed. Cord brought his copied receipt and 9 years of paying very close attention. Evangelina Cross read the deed twice completely still, set it on her desk, looked at Willa. She said, "Tell me about the day you signed this." Willa told her. The kitchen table marker saying it was an easement renewal, the brief reading of the top section. The pen placed in her hand the line indicated. She told her where the magnifying glass was. Evangelina said, "He did not suggest you use it." Willa said, "No." Evangelina said, "Did anyone read the complete document to you before you signed?" Willa said, "No." Evangelina made a note. Then she said, "Mrs. Durance, in this territory, a deed can be challenged and voided when the grantor was prevented from understanding what she was executing by deliberate concealment, by exploitation of a known impairment, or by a notary's failure to discharge his professional obligations. What you've described gives us strong grounds on all 3 counts." She turned back to the desk. "Your documented visual condition, your son's documented knowledge of that condition, and Pell Coover, who was required before affixing that notarial seal to satisfy himself that you understood the instrument you were signing. He clearly did not do that." Cord, from the corner chair where he had been sitting without speaking since they entered, said, "Can she get her land back?" Evangelina looked at him, then at Willa. She said, "Yes, I believe she can." Willa said, "What do we need to do first?" Evangelina said, "First, I file an action in the First Judicial District Court to void the deed, and I request an injunction barring any survey transfer or development activity while the case is pending. That freezes everything. Then I take Coover's deposition, and then I start pulling on the thread that runs from your son to Creel." She paused. She said, "Mrs. Durance, at some point in this proceeding, your son will be named as a party. Whatever arrangement he has with Creel will become part of the public record." Willa looked at her without expression. She said, "My husband and I raised our children to live with the consequences of what they chose. I won't change that standard now because the person being held to it is my son." Evangelina Cross looked at her for a moment, the look of a woman who has done this work long enough to recognize when she sees it, the particular quality of spine that makes a case worth taking and a client worth fighting for. She picked up her pen. The injunction was granted within the week. The first district judge reviewed the filing, the deed, the documented vision impairment, the notarial record, and issued an order: no transfer, no survey, no development activity on the Durance property while the action remained pending. Beaumont Creel received notice at his Phoenix office. His attorney subsequently described his reaction in a letter to a colleague that later became part of the discovery record as considerable. Marcus was served at the ranch house. He stood on the porch and read the papers with the slow, careful attention of a man to whom careful reading was only now becoming a relevant discipline. He folded them. He went inside. He came back out 20 minutes later in his riding coat with a saddlebag over his shoulder and took his horse from the corral. He did not come back. Cord found his room empty the following morning. Clothes, personal items, the condition of a man who had decided that an empty room was preferable to an accounting. He had taken several papers from the desk in the main room. Cord reported this to Willa without commentary. Willa said, "Evangelina has copies of everything." She went out to the East Corral. She worked with the 2-year-old mare for an hour, the patient, repetitive work of building trust between an animal and a human, which requires consistency and a willingness to let the creature move at its own pace without forcing the conclusion. When she came back in, her hands smelled of horse in the cold morning air, and she made coffee and set a second cup on the table without being asked, and Cord sat down across from her. They drank coffee. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, the Rinkins were catching the morning light going from gray to amber, to the particular red copper that happened only in that first hour, the color of fresh terracotta or old blood. The color that had been one of Hector's favorite things about this place, which he used to come out onto the porch to see even when he was exhausted, even in the last winter when getting out of bed in the morning had required the kind of effort you do not discuss. Willa said, I need to say something. Cord looked at her over the cup. She said, you knew before I did that something was wrong. He said, I had a sense of it. She said, you didn't tell me. He said, you weren't ready for me to speculate. You needed the fact. She said, you're right about that. She looked at her coffee. She said, 9 years, Cord. I have been looking at you for 9 years, and I have not. She stopped, started again. I owe you a conversation I have been avoiding. He said quietly, you don't owe me anything. She said, don't do that. Don't make this easier than it is. He was quiet. She said, Hector was a good man. I loved him the way you love the person who helped you build your life from bare dirt. That is a real thing. I am not apologizing for it. He said, I know. She said, after he died, I told myself I was all right. I told myself I didn't need. She stopped again. I was wrong about some of that. The morning light was moving across the floor of the kitchen. The saguaro outside the south window was going gold. Cord set down his cup. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that was as honest as the silence. Willa said, when this is finished, when I have my land back and the record is clean, I want to have a different conversation with you. He held her gaze. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, because Cord Mabry did nothing dramatically, but in the way of a man who has been patient long enough that patience has become indistinguishable from hope and is now something else entirely. He said, I'll be here. She said, I know. The discovery phase of the proceeding was where Beaumont Creel's careful distances became his most significant liability. Evangelina Cross subpoenaed Creel's correspondence regarding the Durance property. His attorney, calculating the relative costs of producing and withholding, produced it. What the letters contained was the familiar moderate carelessness of a man who writes to people he believes will never appear in a courtroom, a looseness of register that assumes an audience of allies. There was a letter from September discussing the Durance matter, and young Durance's timeline for establishing signatory access. A follow-up in October confirming the finder's arrangement, $3,500 to be conveyed upon deed recordation in Pima County. A letter from Marcus written from a Tucson hotel address confirming he had established the necessary conditions for completion before year's end. And a letter from Creel to Marcus that Evangelina would later read aloud in the First District courtroom. We need this in the recorder's office before the rail survey is made public. Every additional week introduces risk of discovery on both ends. The woman needs to sign this week. The letters were authenticated. They went into the case file alongside the Tucson physician's records, specific and thorough, documenting the progressive central vision loss at each appointment, and Pell Coover's deposition, in which he confirmed, after extended careful questioning, that he had not read the deed to Willa, that Marcus had told him she understood the document, and that he had not independently satisfied himself that this was true. That last admission was the admission that closed the door on every remaining available defense. Evangelina wrote it down without expression, thanked him, moved on. Creel's attorney made a settlement offer 3 weeks before the hearing. He proposed that the Durance property be purchased at assessed value by the Creel syndicate, a portion of the proceeds designated to Willa, directly the legal action dismissed. He framed it as an equitable resolution for an elderly widow's peace of mind. Evangelina relayed the offer. Willa listened to the full terms. Then she said, he called me an elderly widow. Evangelina said, he did. Willa said, I'm 58 years old. I've kept this operation running through one drought that killed 2 of every 3 cattle in the territory, a market collapse that wiped out 8 ranchers in this county alone, and 11 years of managing 320 acres without a partner. Elderly. She declined the offer. Cord, who had driven her to the meeting and was waiting in the hall outside, heard the tone through the door, not the words but the register, and stood up straighter the way a man does when he recognizes in clear light something he has known for a long time but has not previously seen all the way. The hearing was held on a cold January morning in the First Judicial District Court in Tucson. The courtroom was low-ceilinged and adobe-walled, heated inadequately by a single cast-iron stove in the northwest corner, and it smelled of wood smoke and dust and the particular dry cold of territorial winter. Judge Ambrose Whitmore had held the district bench for 14 years. He had handled more land title disputes than he could count, and had developed over those years a complete and thorough intolerance for notarial malfeasance and a particular attention to cases involving deliberate exploitation of impairment. He had read every document in the file before taking the bench. Willa wore her dark wool riding dress, the good one, the one she wore to Tucson for serious business. She carried her magnifying glass in her left hand, not concealed. Creel's attorney was a man from Phoenix named Aldous, polished and prepared, the kind of attorney who mistakes a confident manner for a strong case. Marcus was absent, served by publication, having declined to appear from wherever he had gone, which omission Judge Whitmore noted in terms the courtroom reporter had to ask him to repeat for clarity. Pell Coover testified first, consistent with his deposition. He confirmed he had not read the deed to Willa, confirmed Marcus had assured him she understood, confirmed he had not independently satisfied himself this was true. When Judge Whitmore asked him directly, "Mr. Coover, did you have any reason to believe the signatory might be unable to read the instrument without assistance?" There was a long silence before Coover said quietly, "In retrospect, Your Honor, yes." Whitmore made a note. Then Willa took the stand. Evangelina's examination was spare and deliberate. She asked Willa to describe the afternoon of the signing. Willa described it exactly: the kitchen table, the lamp. Marcus saying it was an easement renewal, the pen placed in her hand, the line indicated where the magnifying glass was. Evangelina said, "Did you read the document?" Willa said, "I could not read it at that distance without my glass." Evangelina said, "Why did you not use the glass?" Willa said, "My son did not suggest it, and he presented the document as a routine matter. I trusted him. I believed it was what he told me it was." Evangelina said, "If you had known this was a deed transferring your ranch to your son's name, would you have signed it?" Willa said, "I would not." Evangelina said, "How long have you worked this land, Mrs. Durance?" Willa said, 26 years. Evangelina said, "Thank you." Aldous cross-examined with restraint, the correct instinct, because no jury or judge in the territory was going to respond well to aggressive cross-examination of a 58-year-old woman who had run 320 acres for 26 years. He established that she had signed voluntarily, that she had not been restrained, that she had not expressed confusion at the time. Willa said, "I was not confused. I was deceived. There is a considerable difference." Aldous said, "You trusted your son." Willa said, "I trusted his word about what I was signing because I could not read it without help he did not offer. That is not the same as consenting to the transfer. I trusted the representation. I did not know the representation was a lie." Aldous had no further questions. Cord testified briefly: the survey crew, the job order receipt, what they had told him, the careful precision of his copy. His testimony was short and specific and delivered in the manner of a man who does not state things he cannot verify. Evangelina introduced the Creel correspondence. She read 2 lines into the record. She let them sit in the cold courtroom air for a long moment before she moved on. Judge Whitmore withdrew for 30 minutes. When he returned, he read from a written ruling. He said, "The court finds that the warranty deed filed October 22nd, purporting to convey the Durance property in the Rincon District to Marcus Henry. Durance was obtained through deliberate fraud upon the grantor by means of her documented visual impairment and was notarized in material violation of the notary's professional obligations. The deed is void in its entirety. Title is hereby restored to Wilhelmina Ruth Durance, free and clear of any encumbrance arising from the voided instrument." He set down the ruling. He said, "The court further orders this record referred to the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the Territorial Attorney General's Office for such criminal proceedings as those offices find appropriate. Mr. Coover's conduct will be referred to the Territorial Notarial Commission with a recommendation for suspension." He looked at the room. He said, "Court is adjourned." Willa sat still at the plaintiff's table for a long moment after the gavel. She was holding her magnifying glass the way she had been holding it throughout the hearing, not because she had needed it in the courtroom, but because it had become, over the months since that November morning, in the kitchen, something different to her than it had been before. Not a concession to what she could not do. A reminder of what she had nearly lost by not insisting on using it when it mattered, and what she had recovered by using it when she finally did. Cord was behind her. He said nothing immediately. He stood up. He put his hat on. She rose from the table. She turned around and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the cold winter light fell through the courtroom's high windows, and neither of them said anything for a full 3 seconds. which was in the mathematics of people who do not waste words a very long time. She said, "Take me home." He said, "Yes, ma'am." And then, so that only she could hear it so quietly that it was almost not sound at all, but something closer to the decision to stop holding a thing in that had been held long enough, Willa. Just that. Her name. The name he had not permitted himself to use in 9 years of ma'am and Mrs. Durance and every other proper form of address that had been simultaneously correct and insufficient. She held his eyes for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and he followed, and the cold January air met them when they stepped outside onto Congress Street, and neither spoke again until they were past the edge of the city, and the open desert was stretching ahead, and the Rincons were rising clear and red copper in the afternoon light to the east. Then she said, "You can stop calling me ma'am, effective immediately." He kept his eyes on the road. He said, "Reckon I can work on that." She said, "You've had 9 years of practice." He said, "I've been going slow." She laughed. It surprised her, the fullness of it, the ease of it, the way it came up from somewhere she had not visited in a long time. He glanced at her sideways, and for just a moment the composure broke, and she saw what she recognized: a man who had been waiting a long time to see exactly this, and had not been certain until this moment that the waiting had been worth what it cost. She had seen it. She had been seeing it for longer than she had permitted herself to acknowledge. It is a particular kind of loneliness, she thought, to be looked after by someone who genuinely cares for you when you are not yet in a place to receive it. Cord had been doing exactly that for 9 years, with the patience of a man who understands that some ground takes time to break, and that forcing it only compacts the soil. She had known. She had known for longer than she would have admitted to anyone, including herself. She turned back to the mountains. She said, "When we get back, I want to ride the east boundary line. See what those survey stakes disturbed." He said, "Ground's cold." She said, "I know." He said, "Then we'll ride it." The aftermath of the hearing was quiet, the way true resolutions tend to be. Creel's acquisition plans for the Southern Pacific Corridor did not survive the public record. Several other properties he had assembled over the prior 18 months saw their arrangements quietly reconsidered once the Durance case began appearing in the Tucson papers. The referral to the Territorial Attorney General had by spring become part of a larger investigation into land acquisition practices that had been conducted with certain recurring methodological similarities. Pell Coover was suspended from notarial duties for 2 years by the Territorial Notarial Commission, with a formal censure made part of the permanent record. Marcus was eventually located in Albuquerque, working under a different name in circumstances that suggested the $3,500 had not lasted as long as his optimism had required. The criminal referral caught up with him in the spring. Willa did not attend the criminal proceeding. She did not seek additional civil damages. She told Evangelina, "I have my land. I have the record. What becomes of him now is between him and the law, and whatever he can bring himself to admit about who he chose to be." What she said to no one but Cord on an evening in late April, when the last cold had finally broken and the saguaro were in bloom, and they were sitting on the porch in the first genuinely warm evening of the year, with the desert going lavender. In the last light was that she could not find it in herself to fully hate Marcus. She had thought she would be able to. She had believed in the hard months of the proceeding that she had reached that place. But he was still the boy she had nursed through fever and taught to ride and watched grow into a man she could not quite reach. And she found she was not capable of the final severance. She was not forgiving him. She was being honest the way she required herself to be honest about hard things. Cord listened without speaking, which was the most generous thing he could have done. When she finished, he said, "Ready to talk about something else?" She said, "What did you have in mind?" He said, "I've been meaning to say something to you for about 6 years, and I keep finding reasons to wait, and I have run out of patience for my own reasons." She looked at him in the lamplight from the open door. This man she had trusted with her land and her herd, and the daily truth of her life for 9 years. This quiet, careful, unhurried man who had never once given her cause to doubt him. She said, "Cord Mabry, if you make me sit through another 6 years of waiting for whatever that sentence is, I will personally reroute the secondary spring without consultation." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, a breaking finally of the long composure. He said, "I want to ask you to be my wife." She said, "That took you long enough." He said, "I was building up to it." She said, "Yes." Just that one word. Quiet as the desert at first light, and exactly as complete. The saguaro were in bloom along the arroyo. The rincons held the last light above the ridge, going from copper to rose, to the deep particular blue that preceded dark. The 2-year-old mare was moving somewhere beyond the South Corral fence, unhurried in the long evening. Willa Durance sat on the porch of her land on the slope above the rincones, with her magnifying glass in her hand, and the mountains going dark at the edge of the world. And she felt for the first time in a very long time that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Before I let you go, and I mean this from the ground up, there's something I want to say. If you've been listening to this story and thinking about someone, a mother, an aunt, a neighbor, a grandmother, who is out there managing more than most people know, I want you to do one thing, just one. Check on them. Ask them if there is anyone helping with their papers and their finances. Ask them if they understand everything they've been asked to put their name to. Ask them whether the person they trust most is earning that trust right now today. You do not need to be an attorney to ask those questions. You only need to be paying attention. Willa Durance had Cord Mabry, who paid attention when it mattered. She had 26 years of hard desert living that had taught her that the truth is something you read for yourself with your own eyes in your own time, even if that takes longer than other people want to wait for you. And she had the particular stubbornness, the kind the frontier either grinds down to dust or sharpens into something useful, and had in her case been sharpening since she was a girl, to refuse to let what was hers be taken by someone who had calculated that her eyes were too far gone to fight back. He miscalculated. She could see just fine. If this story moved you, if it made you reach for the phone or think of someone who needs a call, hit that like button and share it with someone who ought to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be back next week with another story. Tell me where you're listening from. Drop your state in the comments. We want to know you're out there. Take care of the people around you. That's the whole thing. That's all of it.